Welcome back to the 99th online episode of Peacetime, hosted every Sunday morning by Peace Point with myself, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, coming to you today from DIMC in Azusa, California. In the previous session, we looked at the first of the Buddha's teachings, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and today we continue on our journey through an anthology of important suttas from the Buddhist scriptures by looking at the final of the Buddha's discourses called the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta. I estimate today's session will run to about an hour and a quarter with a 30-minute break halfway through for some meditation. So as usual with our chosen sutta, we will work our way through the sequence of sources, sutta name meaning, interlocutors, place names, and background before looking at the main body of the manuscript itself and finishing up with some of the issues the sutta raises. Since the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta is a lengthy one, even by the standards of the Digha Nikaya, I noticed most monks out there take 6 or 8 sermons to cover the sutta content in full. So, with my single allotted session, I apologize in advance for merely being able to scratch the surface. So today's presentation will be more like getting familiar with the contents page of the sutta, together with a few brief highlights. Nonetheless, I will try to say enough to glean the important substance from this significant sutta. The sutta we'll be studying in today's session is the 16th of the lengthy discourses of the Buddha, or Digha Nikaya. More specifically, it comes from the second volume of the Digha Nikaya known as the Rājagaha. It is referenced in Western scholarship as D272 onwards or DN16. Today the translation manuscript I'll make use of is Maurice Walsh's Wisdom Publications edition version of the Long Discourses of the Buddha. So the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta has been noted as being the longest of all extant ancient Indian literary compositions. It is unique in being neither a dialogue nor a speech, but a continuous record of the latter part of the Buddha's life. It has been dated as being composed no later than 375 BCE, but the final redaction would have taken place a good deal later. There is a lot of satisfaction from studying the sutta all the way through because it comes across as a historical epic. It is like a hub that is a later compilation of similar but incomplete shorter discourses from the earlier Sampasadaniya, Janavasapha, Kalingara, and Mahasudassana suttas. Generally, the more original materials that are contained in a sutta, the earlier it is supposed to have been written. So we know that the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta is not original. Nonetheless, roughly 1/3 of the sutta, 32 to 33 pages worth of content, is not found anywhere else in the Buddhist scriptures. The importance of the sutta is witnessed by the way it appears in 6 main recensions in the various scriptural languages of Buddhism across all the extant denominations of Buddhism. The slide shows Parinibbāna in the Japanese Soto Zen tradition. Comparisons between the different versions of the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta from the different denominations have been the main subject of research of the scholar André Barrault. So the background to this sutta is that at the end of the Buddha's life, after almost half a century's ministry, he had long since taught his disciples all that was necessary for attaining enlightenment. In his declining years, the Buddha's primary concern was to impress on his followers the necessity of unflinchingly putting into practice those very same teachings, an appeal that, more than ever before, could hardly fail to stir their hearts. The monastic community assembled to witness the greatest event in its history, and was keenly aware of it, especially since the Buddha had foretold his passing 3 months in advance. There must have been a tremendous impression on the monks who flocked to him in large numbers as he reached his end. The 3rd chapter of the sutta especially is devoted to depicting the circumstances connected with the Buddha's letting go of life, which is a dramatic culmination of events because the Buddha neither succumbed to his fatal illness, nor did he give in to the appeal of Mara, in the absence of an appeal by Ananda. He independently decides to let go of existence at the time of the hour just as 45 years earlier, on becoming fully enlightened, he had duly taken upon himself the ambitious task of teaching the Dhamma to others. This might lead us to the conclusion that by his Parinirvana, the Buddha exemplified the last and highest possible testimony to his teaching, which allowed for no lingering inclination to self-preservation or continuance, but on the contrary reached towards the highest exaltation of breaking free. The Buddha's Parinirvana is therefore the one sorrowful event in the history of the Buddhism that turns out in its true meaning to be really the most inspiring. So this sutta is generally divided into 6 chapters. Mostly divided by the location in which they took place. The title Mahāparinibbāna Sutta can be translated literally in 2 ways, either as the Discourse on the Great Parinirvana or the Great Discourse on the Parinirvana. However, it is clear that only the first version can be correct for 2 reasons. Firstly, if we translate it as the Great Discourse, then there should be an accompanying Chula Parinibbāna Sutta, the lesser discourse on the Parinirvana, but there is none. Secondly, Maha being affixed to Parinirvana clearly qualifies that as being the Great Parinirvana, signifying that it is the Buddha's final passing. This emphasizes that it is Parinirvana as opposed to merely Nibbana, without getting into the debate here about whether or in what state the Buddha might continue to exist after death. So seeing as there is a lot of interlocutors in this sutta, I'll just make an annotated list of them more or less in alphabetical order. You'll notice some distinct people have identical names, which tells us that although the sutta is considered to be literature, it is unlikely to be fiction. The Buddha is referred to in this translation also by the epithets of the Lord, the Blessed Lord, or Reverend Gautama. Venerable Ananda, the main personal attendant to the Buddha, also plays an important role in many ways in this sutta. Of course, it is his memory that preserves many scriptural texts for us, including this sutta. This Mahāparinibbāna Sutta would plainly be unimaginable without him, for it is Ananda whom the Buddha addresses repeatedly, having tested for 25 years his sure grasp, brilliant memory, and unwavering personal devotion. But Ananda too, here more than elsewhere, by his constant questions, worries, and feedback, becomes, without intending it, a central figure beside the Buddha himself, which undoubtedly increases the readability of the text. He occupies a strange position between praise and blame, especially in the 3rd chapter. Rājagaha gets a mention from the devotee Kusinārā, but is no longer alive by the time this sutta was given. Alara had been one of the teachers to whom Gautama had attached himself immediately after his renunciation. Ambapali was a beautiful courtesan from Vesalī, who in this sutta is delighted to offer a meal to the Buddha and later donates her mango grove Paṭaligāma as a Buddhist temple. Later both she and her son ordained and both attained arahantship. Venerable Anuruddha was the first cousin of the Buddha himself and one of the most eminent disciples, foremost in the angelic eye, which allowed him to trunk the Buddha through his final meditational journey. Venerable Channa was the Buddha's former charioteer. He suffered from arrogance because he thought everyone owed him for having driven the chariot that took Gautama to see the 4 sights, and for having ridden with him on the night Gautama renounced the palace life. In the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta, we see how the Buddha puts in place a punishment to posthumously humble Channa. Moving on, we come to Chunta, who was a layman who worked as a smith in the city of Pāvā and accommodated the monastic community in his mango grove. He also offered the Buddha his last meal before entering upon Parinirvana. Next is Venerable Chundaka, whose full name is Chunda Samanudesa, and is not to be confused with Chunda the layman, who I have just mentioned. This Chundaka was a monk who was the younger brother of Venerable Sariputta, and who appears briefly as attending the Buddha by spreading a bed for him, presumably before then leaving to accompany his brother Sariputta on his final journey. Dona was an influential Brahmin teacher of Kusinārā, whose intervention to fairly divide up the Buddha's relics prevented a quarrel between the assembled kings. Venerable Mahākassapa was one of the Buddha's most eminent disciples, and at the Buddha's passing was the most senior monk to outlive him. He is not present at the beginning of the sutta, but receives news of the Buddha's passing and arrives 7 days afterward to preside over the cremation. Venerable Mahamoggallana is the left-hand disciple of the Buddha and does not appear in the sutta personally, since he passes away 2 weeks before the Buddha does. The Mallas of Kusinārā are the local chieftains governing the territory that reached as far as Pāvā and who came to pay their last respects to the Buddha. Ukusa Malla Rājagaha was a former disciple of Pāṭaligāma, and who, after conversation with the Buddha in this sutta, becomes the final lay convert. Sahampati was a Mahabrahma who appeared at various important junctures in the Buddha's life, encouraging him to teach after the Buddha's enlightenment, but in this sutta he appears in the final verse to express his homage at the passing of the Buddha. Sakka, which is more of a title than a personal name for the king of the second level of heaven, also appears in the final verse to express his homage at the passing of the Buddha. Venerable Sariputta is the right-hand disciple of the Buddha and does appear in the sutta personally, giving some teachings before taking his leave of the Buddha in order to pass away at his birthplace several months before the Buddha passes away. Venerable Supata, the first of 2 with the same name, was an old, stubborn monk who had formerly been a barber in Hitoma. After becoming a monk, he resented having to observe the various monastic rules, large and small. The second Venerable Supata had formerly been a Brahmin of high rank, and through his determination was the last to become enlightened under the Buddhist dispensation. The Lichavis of Vesalī were a powerful tribe that was part of the Vajjian Confederacy and governed themselves as a republic. Venerable Upawana was an attendant to the Buddha who appears briefly in the sutta, fanning him, and is asked to move to the side so that he would not obstruct the view of celestial beings who have come to pay their last respects. Rasakara and Sunita are Magadhan chief ministers sent as envoys by King Ajatasattu to discover whether there was any chance of conquering the Vajjian Confederacy in battle. They were both in charge of building fortifications at Pāṭaligāma. Finally, there is a group of supporters for whom Ananda inquires as to past life destinations, who play no other role in this sutta: the monk Salha, the nun Nanda, the layman Kutta, Kalinga, Katisapa, Nikata, Tutta, Santutta, Pata, Supata, and Sudatta, but not the more famous chief male supporter, and a laywoman called Sujata, but not the more famous one who offered milk rice. So there is not a single location associated with the sutta because it is a travelogue of the last journey made by the Buddha over the course of several months. So it's better to relate the place names mentioned in the sutta in terms of the map of the Buddha's final journey, which is shown on the slide. So the start of the journey is in Magadha, near the capital of Rājagaha, ruled over by King Ajatasattu. The mountain called Vulture's Peak or Gijjakutta is the place the Buddha was staying at the beginning of the sutta. From there, the Buddha journeys through Ambalatika and Pāṭaligāma, which the Buddha predicts will become fortified later as Pāṭaliputta in the time of the Emperor Ashoka. In Chapter 2, the Buddha journeys from Pāṭaligāma to Vesalī, Vaishali on the map, via Kodigama and Nadika. Vesalī is where the Buddha receives the gift of Ambapali's mango grove, and Baluva near Vesalī is where the Buddha spends his last rains retreat. In Chapter 3, the Buddha has a run-in with Mara at the Kapila shrine in Vesalī. Chapter 4 tells of the Buddha's journey from Bandagama near Vesalī, initially to Pāvā, to receive his final meal from Chunta, and then in Chapter 5 on to Kusinārā, where the Buddha spends his last days in Upawatana Grove, Kusinārā, modern-day Kusinārā. Also, this sutta mentions the locations of all 4 holy sites that commemorate the life of the Buddha, which he says are worthy of pilgrimage. So turning to the first chapter of the manuscript, which is set in Rājagaha in Magadha, we find in paragraph 1.1, which is set at Vijakuta, the Vulture's Peak, in Rājagaha, about 1 year before the Buddha's Parinirvana. The king Ajasatru of Magadha plans to conquer the Vachi Confederacy. We find in paragraph 1.2 to 1.3 that Ajasatru sent his chief minister, the Brahmin Vasakkara, to consult the Buddha. We find in paragraph 1.4 to 1.5 that the Buddha speaks on the 7 conditions for social prosperity, or in Pali, the Vachi Apaniharya Dhamma, which consist of firstly to meet regularly and frequently, secondly to meet together in harmony, disperse in harmony, and go about one's business and duties in harmony. Thirdly, to introduce no revolutionary ordinance, or break up no established ordinance, but abide by the original or fundamental Vajrayana norm and principles. Fourthly, to honor and respect the elders amongst the Vajrayans, and deem them worthy of listening to. Fifth, that the women and girls of the families are to dwell in peace without being abused or trafficked. Sixth, to honor and worship the Vajrayan shrines, monuments, and objects of worship, both central and provincial, and not to neglect righteous ceremonies held there. And lastly, provide the rightful protection, shelter, and support for the Arahants, and wish that the Arahants who have not yet come might enter the realm, and those who have already entered may have a pleasant stay. This advice is still relevant for politicians in the present day. We find in paragraph 1.6 through paragraph 1.11 that the Buddha adapts the 7 conditions of national prosperity to monastic society, where the only real changes are at point 5, where the Buddha advocates monks not to fall prey to craving. 6. To delight in forest dwelling, and lastly, to extend hospitality to well-practicing visiting monks. He goes on to immediately give an alternative set of 7 for the prosperity of the monastic community at paragraph 1.8, comprising not getting caught up in distracting business, not indulging in gossip, sleeping or socializing, not falling under the influence of evil desires, not associating with bad company, and not getting waylaid from the path to enlightenment by lesser successes. In paragraph 1.9, the Buddha enumerates the 7 awakening factors, or in Pali, Bodhangpa, which are mindfulness, truth investigation, striving, joy, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. Next, in paragraph 1.10, comes the 7 things monks, if they are not to decline in the practice, should strive clearly to perceive, namely impermanence, non-self, loathsomeness, danger, overcoming dispassion and cessation. Then in paragraph 1.11, he comes to 6 things conducive to fraternal living, otherwise known as the Saraniyatama, that as long as monks show loving kindness to their fellows, both in public and in private, through acts of body, speech, and mind, sharing any lawful gains with virtuous fellows, keeping the rules of conduct without blemish, and endowed with right view along with their fellows, they may be expected to prosper and not to decline. As the Buddha moves on from Rājagaha to Pāṭaligāma, we find in paragraph 1.12 he gives a discourse on the 3 trainings in Pali Sikha, and as he mentions these several times during the same sutta, I will skip these from here on in. Skipping to paragraph 1.15 at Nalanda, the Buddha and his monastic order stay at the Pavarika mango grove. Then we find in paragraphs 1.16 and 1.17 that Sariputta's line, roar, or declaration of faith in the Buddha. As the Buddha moves on to Pāṭaligāma in paragraphs 1.19 through 1.25, he stays at a rest house and receives food offerings there, exhorting the audience on moral virtue. We find in paragraphs 1.26 through 1.28 prediction of Pāṭaligāma's future fortifications when it becomes a great capital of Pāṭaliputta at the center of Asoka's empire. We find in paragraphs 1.29 and 1.30 that Sunita and Vasakkara, chief ministers of Magadha, offer the Buddha and the Sangha a meal, and paragraphs 1.31 and 1.32 take place on the banks of the river Ganges. So in spite of the Buddha's declining health, he was constantly traveling together with a large number of monks, walking barefoot and helping many people, meeting many, explaining things and also advising the monks, so compassionate up to the very last. So turning to chapter 2, we are told about the Buddha's journey from Pāṭaligāma to Vesalī. So starting out in Kotigama, we find in paragraphs 2.1 through 2.3, the Buddha addressing the monks on the Four Noble Truths. Skipping to paragraphs 2.5 through 2.9 at Nadika, Ananda asked the Buddha about the rebirth destinations of various recently deceased followers, the monk Salha, who had become an arahant, and the nun Nanda, who has become a non-returner, the lay follower Sudatta, who has become a once-returner, and the lay woman follower Sujata, who has become a stream enterer. The lay followers Kukutta, Kalinga, Nikata, Kritisapha, Sutta, Santutta, Pata, and Supata, all of whom have become non-returners. The Buddha then discourses on the subject of the mirror of the Dharma, which means that the afterlife destinations of a person can be predicted to be a good one if they have faith in the Triple Gem, have closed the door on the nether realms, have reached stream entry, and are certain of attaining nirvana. Moving on to Vesalī, we find in paragraphs 2.11 through 2.13 that the Buddha stays over at Ambapali's mango grove, where he gives a short discourse to the monks on mindfulness, or sati, and clear comprehension, or sampajañña, that are the essence of the meditation practice. In paragraph 2.14, the courtesan Ambapali, who owns the mango grove, invites the Buddha and his order for a meal on the following day. We see in paragraphs 2.15 through 2.17 that the Lichavis of Vesalī try to bribe Ambapali with 100,000 kahapanas, which is the currency of that time, to give up the chance to offer the meal in their favor, but she turns down the offer. Then we find in paragraph 2.18 that the Lichavis meet the Buddha and hear a Dhamma discourse. We see in paragraph 2.19 that after the alms offering, Ambapali donates her mango grove to the monastic community. Moving on to Beluva, near Vesalī, in paragraphs 2.21 through 2.26, we read about the Buddha's first attack of dysentery, but considering it an inopportune moment, he makes an effort to recover quickly. The chronic nature of the Buddha's illness is also explained here. The Buddha declares his open-handedness as a teacher with no secrets kept back from his disciples. He admonishes the monks to take the self as a refuge, depending on the translation of the ambiguous Pali word dipa, which means either a lamp or, more probably, an island unto oneself. The self referring to here being the true self, what we would refer to in our lineage as the Dhammakaya. Moving on to chapter 3, we can see the circumstances that lead to the Buddha relinquishing the will to live. The manuscript picks up at paragraph 3.1 in Vesalī with the Buddha on alms round. Reaching the Kapala shrine between paragraph 3.2 and 3.6, we see that the Buddha praises various shrines. The Buddha drops the hint to Ananda about the possibility of extending his lifespan, because there are certain situations where the Buddha could live beyond the normal human life expectancy using his meditational powers to control his bodily aging and sickness. The usual lifespan of a Buddha described in the 14th sutta of the Digha Nikaya, called the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta, where the Buddha mentions the various lifespans of 6 historical Buddhas. For Vipassi Buddha it was at 80,000 years, for Sikhi Buddha it was 70,000 years, for Vesapu Buddha it was 60,000 years, for Prakusanta Buddha it was 40,000 years, for Konagamana Buddha it was 30,000 years, for Kassapa Buddha it was 20,000 years. Unfortunately, in our sutta, Ananda is oblivious and fails to take the hint. Therefore, because of Ananda's omission, for our Buddha Gautama, the lifespan only got to be 80 years, with the opportunity to teach the Dhamma for only 45 years. It is said that the Venerable Ananda was influenced by the Mara to forget to invite the Buddha to live longer. Perhaps he was stressed out, having learned about the Buddha's medical prognosis, to the point that he could not understand what the Buddha was hinting at. Next, we find in the paragraphs 3.7 and 3.8 that Mara jumps into the vacuum left by Ananda and instead invites the Buddha to enter Parinirvana as quickly as possible. The Buddha explained to the Mara that he would only agree to go when his succession plan was in place, namely, when Buddhism's future was guaranteed and well established. So the Mara insisted everything was already in place, that all 4 communities of bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, laymen and laywomen had all learned the Dharma practice and their future was secure. The Mara, in their usual style, were in a hurry for the Buddha to pass away so that they could return to immersing humankind in ignorance. In fact, they had already tried to dispatch the Buddha before his enlightenment without teaching anything to the world, and again in the 5th week after his enlightenment. The work of the Mara had already been disrupted for 45 long years by the Buddha's mission of traveling and preaching for the wisdom, welfare and benefit of the many folk. So the only thing the Buddha insisted on was to have a succession plan in place of Buddhism. So until that time he did not want to accept the Mara's invitation. But Mara reminded the Buddha of his promise that he had apparently made to relinquish his lifespan during the 5th week after his enlightenment. From paragraph 3.9 onwards, we see that the Buddha lets go of his hopes to extend his lifespan. Some people wonder why a person should have to follow rules that seem unfair or unbeneficial to humanity. In reply to this, I can only say that sometimes it is futile to do otherwise, a bit like trying to rescind the law of gravity because it hurts people who fall off roofs. In the same way, some things are just too large for the average person or even a Buddha to change. Great earth tremors take place, and in paragraph 3.11 through 3.20, the Buddha explains the 8 causes of earth tremors, which might be for geological reasons, because of celestial beings with mental powers, because of the Bodhisattva descending from Dusita heaven, because of the birth of the Bodhisattva into the world, because the Tathagata becomes enlightened, because of the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dharma, or because the Tathagata relinquishes his claim on life, or when the Tathagata enters Parinirvana. So the last 2 reasons apply directly to this sutta. Next, the Buddha discourses on the 8 assemblies, or in Pali Parisa, from paragraphs 3.24 through 3.32. The 8 stages of mastery, or in Pali Abhipayatana, and then in paragraph 3.33, the 8 stages of liberation, or in Pali Vimokkha. The latter 2 concern the formless Brahma absorptions, and I will not go into any more detail on these. The Buddha informs Ananda of Mara's visits and of his now unavoidable Parinirvana. Only now, realizing his omission, in paragraphs 3.38 through 3.48, we see that Ananda beseeches the Buddha to extend his lifespan. The Buddha rebukes him for his hesitance and informs him that the chance has been lost. So this is the point where the Buddha officially decides that this is it, and it is time to leave the world. The Buddha had made his decision and could not take it back. So at this climactic point in our sutta, it turns out that we have come about halfway. So before we continue with the remainder of the sutta, perhaps it's a good juncture to settle down for 30 minutes of meditation, which today is entitled Letting Go of Anxiety. If at this time you would like to find a comfortable sitting position for yourself as you listen to my guidance. So let's make a start by relaxing ourselves. When we're ready, we can find a comfortable sitting position, making sure our phone is on silent or turned off completely, loosening any tight clothing, and doing whatever else we need to become fully comfortable. Reminding ourselves that this is time for ourselves, a dreamy inward time that allows us, through the power of our subconscious mind, to come closer to our goals. And whether we listen consciously or our mind wanders to distractions, one way or another, our subconscious will absorb the information it needs. At any time, if we realize our mind is wandering, it's just a case of gently bringing it back to the sound of my voice. So to begin with, let's start with a technique that's been developed to help us shift more directly to a deeper, more tranquil state. And as we begin to ease into comfort, we might take a moment to imagine tiny weights that cause our eyelids to droop, becoming heavier and heavier until it's hard to keep them open. And as our eyes slowly close, we allow our awareness to drift down deeper and deeper. And as our breathing slows right down, starting from the top of our head, we'll sense a soothing warmth that radiates downward and gently loosens all the tightness in the muscles of our scalp and forehead, permeating our body and mind. A soothing warmth that moves downward, softening the tiny muscles around our eyes. And then the tide of relaxation moves down into our cheeks and jaw, easing, unwinding, draining all the tension from our head, melting away into soft warmth as our muscles become as smooth as silk, and then down into our neck, all the way down. If our mind wanders, we can gently bring it back, relaxing more and more deeply as any tight muscles at the back of our neck loosen, and then down into our spine, the muscles surrounding our spine, easing, unwinding, dissolving, melting away any tension from our back and shoulders. And slowly we feel the warmth move down through the tops of our shoulders, through our arms, all the way down through our elbows, forearms and wrists, to our hands and even the tips of our fingers. We may even feel a slight, pleasant, tingling sensation of relaxation in our fingertips and a deep contentment all through our upper body. And now we feel the warmth in our chest as we are breathing slowly, slowing right down. And the soft warmth of relaxation flows into our stomach, bathing the muscles of our core, as these muscles are softened and soothed in tender relaxation. And then down, all the way down, all the way through our hips, our thighs, our knees, our calves, our ankles, and our feet. Right the way down to the tips of our toes, all the way down, protected in the soft warmth of calm, well-being, safely protected, at ease with our mind, and tranquil. And with our body relaxed, with our whole body replete in its state of comfort, it becomes less and less necessary for us to squirm or fidget. And with any tension drained from our body, we can focus on our breath as we allow our awareness to go even deeper, becoming one with the soft, gentle rhythm of our breath. So withdrawing inward with the gentle pull of the breath, allowing ourselves to drift deeper, ever deeper, into relaxation, until it almost feels as if we are drifting on a layer of cloud-like softness, as we feel our way gently to a standstill. From here we can start to let go of any worries, as if we are becoming aware of a heavy, hypothetical backpack that we've been constantly carrying around. A pack that has up until now been so heavy, and realizing how much of the weight has been made up of thoughts and anxieties that have been weighing us down, hindering us from our chosen goals, as if it has relegated our journey through life to walking through treacle. So we recognize the niggling thoughts that have been the reason for the heaviness of our burden, the useless rock-like sack of worries and fears we have dragged around with us every day of our life. And at this point, with sudden clarity and understanding, we can gently pull ourselves free of our burden and let it tumble to the ground. And as we do so, we feel a tremendous relief, realizing how much lighter and freer we have become without that useless cargo of anxiety that will now no longer burden us, freeing up new space in our heart and mind for lightness and freedom, for peace of mind, for joy, to allow us to face life with a new spring in our step. So from this point on, we sink instead into blissful comfort as we are lulled by a sense of warmth and a glow of the light which seems to shine forth from within our body, extending all the way from the top of our head to the tips of our toes, and which shields us in perfect contentment and safety, forming an impenetrable barrier against anything worrisome, since we are now safe and protected, perfectly at peace, perfectly at ease. And from this point forth, the mind will automatically sidestep any worry and let any thoughts settle into tranquility. So with this mechanism now firmly in place in our mind, worries can no longer get a foothold, but slip easily away from us. From there, we simply allow the mind to remain in stillness at the center of the body, at the seventh base of the mind, which is located at the center of our stomach, about 2 finger breadths above the level of the navel, in the center of our body. The center of the body is particularly important because it's the only place inside us where the mind can break completely free of thought. It's the place inside us where mind and body can come into balance. It's aligned with the turning point of the deepest breath, and it's the center of wisdom inside us. All we need to do is bring our mind, which normally wanders outside of ourselves, back to this point in the center of our body, in a soft and gentle way, resting it there consistently, lightly and gently the whole of the time. If we can rest our mind at this point in a light and gentle way, we'll have the feeling of expansion inside ourselves. Those who prefer to have some structure to their meditation might like to imagine a bright object there, such as a bright, shining sun, a full moon, a star, or a diamond at our center. But the way we imagine such an image should be gentle, soft, and continuous, as if we were looking at a commonplace object, such as a rose, something we don't normally bother to stare at, but can just gaze at gently. In fact, it doesn't have to be a rose. It can be any object which we habitually think about. Whatever we choose, we should imagine it continuously, in a light and gentle way. If we reach the perfect equilibrium in our meditation, we'll have a sense of lightness and expansion at the center of the body. We'll find that the inner experience expands outwards. However, if we have the feeling in our meditation that something is blunt or stressed, narrow or inauthentic, then we shouldn't force ourselves to go further with meditation that feels like that. Better that we open our eyes and then close them to reset our meditation. Then picking up where we left off, gently, lightly, and patiently, with our mind at a standstill at the center, in a subtle and gentle way, with our mind bright and clear at the center. And if we like, we might also repeat the sound of the mantra to ourselves, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, repeating the mantra for as long as we feel comfortable with it. Some people might have previously trained in breathing meditation, in which they might say Samma to themselves on the in-breath and Arahang to themselves on the out-breath. If we find repeating it helps us, it means that we can keep on repeating it over and over again to ourselves until our mind comes to a standstill at the center. Once the mind starts to come to a standstill, then the sound of Samma Arahang will die away all by itself, almost as if we forgot to maintain the mantra. But if our mind is restless and wanders to other matters, then we need to stick with the mantra. If our mind is no longer wandering, and there are no more thoughts arising, we can just let the mantra die away, since the mantra has already served its purpose. We continue merely by maintaining our mind gently and in stillness at our center. But if this seems to be too much structure and the mind is already slowing down, we can just remain within ourselves for a few more moments in silence. So we continue to keep our mind gently on track at the center of the body. If our attention wanders away, we bring it back again each time. If the inner object disappears, we can conjure up a new one. If it changes, then we just follow it in its new form. If we find when visualizing, we still cannot resist the temptation to use our eyes to stare down at the center of the body, we might try the technique of imagining that the center of the body has enlarged outwards in size, all the way to the horizon. And it is so large that the whole of our body actually fits inside the center of our body, instead of the other way round. And our awareness remains in stillness at the center of this juxtaposition. We may find that our mantra tails off completely, and we are content to sit in silence, which is yet another vindication of the pioneering advice that stopping is the secret of success. Because when the mind grinds to a standstill, there will be a feeling of opening up, of expansion, as if breaking free from narrow confines. There will be a feeling of lightness and contentment in the mind. The body will seem to enlarge until it disappears, merging with the atmosphere around it. All that will be left is a sense of stillness, as if we were floating at the center of an infinite space. When they reach this point in the meditation, some people have no idea of what to do next. Because it's like being airborne, but having lost our bearings or our sense of direction. We may find we don't even know where the center is anymore. If this happens, we just rest our mind anywhere that seems comfortable, and the mind will continue its journey to one-pointedness, technically known as ekaggata. Still, firm, soft, and comfortable, as the mind reaches toward ever-increasing purity, until the underlying light of purity starts to show through. At this point, some people experience joy that they have managed to overcome the hindrances. Energy that can manifest itself in various ways. But we continue to remain in stillness, just pretending we're not interested, until the mind picks up on the inward attraction that will draw it through the center. Or we may perceive a tiny pinprick of light that is the source of the internal brightness, as small as a single star in the firmament, or in some cases it may be larger than this, shining with a mirror-like brightness, which is the manifestation of one-pointedness, although the mind experiences it with the smoothness of equanimity, paving the way for the arising of further attainments inside, along an inner pathway that can be referred to as the path of purity, or the path of liberation. In some meditation lineages, they teach the meditator to reject anything that arises in the mind. But at this stage in our meditation, the inner experience is worth cherishing, worth our special attention. To discard experiences we have attained at this stage would be like rowing a boat until reaching the shore, and then pushing off and rowing back again, infinitely repeating our journey. So we economize our effort and cherish the inner experience to the point that we can take it deeper. So we continue with our meditation in this way for a few more moments now in silence, until we come to the appropriate time. Sappa Buddhanupavena, Sappa Dhammanupavena, Sappa Saṅghanupavena Satthaosoti Bhavantu. So if you'd like to come to the end of your meditation for today, you can gradually open your eyes again. If you feel at all uncomfortable, then slowly try changing to a more comfortable position before gradually finishing your practice. So returning gently to our subject matter for today of the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta, we pick up where we left off at chapter 4. We see mention of the last meal of the Buddha. So picking up at Pāṭaligāma, we find in paragraph 4.1, on leaving Vesalī, the Buddha gives that city the elephant look, which means that, like an elephant, he turned his body completely around to look back the way he had come. Explained to Ananda that he would not ever have the chance to see that city again in his lifetime. He continues in paragraphs 4.2 and 4.3 to expand the usual 3 trainings into 4 trainings that comprise self-discipline, concentration, wisdom, and liberation, or in Pali, vimutti. We find in paragraphs 4.5 and 4.6 that he journeyed through the various villages of Hatigama, Ambagama, Jampogama, and Bhoganagara. In paragraphs 4.7 through 4.11, the Buddha gives the teaching on the 4 great authorities, or in Pali, Mahāpatesa, which mean that after the passing of the Buddha, any disputes can be resolved by referring to the latter 3 sources of authority in the Buddha's place, which are the community of monks, a number of elder monks, or a single elder monk, as their authority. Coming to paragraph 4.13, the Buddha reaches the mango grove of Chunda in Pāvā, and the owner of the grove, Chunda the smith, invites the Buddha and the monastic community to receive a meal from him on the following morning. Next morning, in paragraphs 4.18 and 4.19, the Buddha finds out that the meal is going to include an ingredient called sukaramatava, which Thais normally translate as sweet pork, but is now more widely understood, including by our own Dr. Sunil Jayasinghe, who wrote a book on it called The Last Meal of the Buddha, to mean literally pig's delight, and which probably had the active ingredient of truffles. So it is a tragic story about the offering of this last meal. The Buddha's last meal only made his sickness worse in the form of food poisoning. The Buddha appeared to know what was coming because he even asked Chunda not to give the meal to anyone else. Next we find paragraphs 4.20 and 4.21 that the Buddha suffers a second serious attack of dysentery because the poisonous nature of his last meal made him very thirsty. In paragraphs 4.22 through 4.25, Ananda fetches water for the Buddha to drink from the Kakuta river, but miraculously the murky water clears of itself. The river still exists in the present day, although it is much smaller and is known as the Kaki River. Next, in paragraphs 4.26 and 4.27, Ukusa Malabuddha meets the Buddha and mentions Alara Lama, who was so calm in his meditation that he failed to notice 500 carts passing right in front of him. Later on, in paragraphs 4.28 through 4.32, the Buddha talks about how he similarly meditated at a threshing house in Atuma and failed to notice a thunderstorm that had struck several people dead by lightning. Consequently, in paragraphs 4.33 and 4.34, that Ukusa is so impressed that he offers the Buddha robes and takes refuge as the last layman to do so while the Buddha was still alive. Once Ukusa has departed, it becomes obvious to Ananda in paragraphs 4.35 through 4.38 that the Buddha's radiance has dimmed. Having bathed in the Kakuta river in paragraphs 4.39 through 4.41, that the Buddha accepts a robe from the Venerable Chundaka and lies down on his right side. Lastly, to exonerate Chunda, the donor of his final meal, of any possible remorse, in paragraphs 4.42 and 4.43, the Buddha preaches that the two most meritorious meals received in his lifetime were the meal that carried him to enlightenment and the meal that would carry him to Parinirvana, breaking free of the cycle of rebirth. So the Buddha reassured Chunda that there was nothing wrong because Chunda had only had the purest of intentions. In effect, since the time of his death was predestined, the Buddha had to find something to die of. So you can see how thorough the Buddha was in not letting Chunda be blamed for his death, which was destined to happen regardless. Moving on to paragraph 5, since the Buddha has now taken his last place of rest between the two sal trees, the whole of chapter 5 takes place in the Upavachana grove at Kusinārā. If you have visited Kusinārā or Kusinārā, there is a prototypic reclining Buddha statue that expresses the grief and suffering of the Buddha's disciples at the last moments of the Buddha's life. Paragraphs 5.1 through 5.6 report widespread miracles such as the trees breaking out in unseasonable blossom and raining down of heavenly blossom and perfumed sandalwood powder. But the Buddha teaches the Venerable Upavana, who is fanning him, that the highest respect is to practice the teaching of the Buddha rather than offering material gifts in respect. Nonetheless, it is obvious that the celestial beings are grieving alongside the Buddha's disciples. Although he was dying, the Buddha wanted his disciples to approach him if they had any final questions. When the Buddha was alive, doubts could be overcome by questioning the Buddha. Ananda takes the full opportunity to do this in paragraphs 5.7 and 5.8, where Ananda voices his concern that the sight of the Buddha or darshana that was previously a blessing to all his disciples would no longer be available after his passing. In response, the Buddha explains that by making pilgrimage to the 4 holy places associated with his life, with faith in their hearts, disciples could be reborn in heaven. In Pali, these places are known as the saṁvega satthana, literally the places to inspire a sense of urgency. So the places all the followers of the Buddha should try to go to and visit are firstly his birthplace at Lumbini in modern-day Nepal. Second one is the place where he was enlightened at Bodh Gaya. The third place is Saranath, where the Buddha preached his first sermon called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. The fourth place is Kusinārā, where the Buddha was lying on his deathbed at the time. Next, in paragraph 5.9, Ananda asks how monks should henceforth conduct themselves toward women. Ananda, of course, was known for being an advocate for the women's cause in Buddhism. The Buddha said that monks should try not to see women, but if they had to see them, then they should not speak to them. But if they could not avoid speaking to them, then they should establish themselves in mindfulness when doing so. Next, we see the Venerable Ananda's concern about performing the funeral rites in the appropriate way. For example, how to cremate the body. So we see in paragraphs 5.10 and 5.11 how Ananda asks how the bodily remains of the Buddha should be treated. The Buddha admonishes Ananda not to trouble himself with the funeral rites, which should be left to the laity. Nonetheless, the Buddha explains in paragraph 5.12 that there are 4 types of people deemed worthy of a stupa, or in Pali, Tuparaha, Pugala, a fully enlightened Buddha, a Pajika Buddha, an enlightened disciple of the Buddha, and the wheel-turning monarch. Even the Venerable Ananda was having a very hard time with grief, since he was still not yet fully enlightened. He was only a stream enterer. Nonetheless, the Buddha praised Ananda for having been the best and most dedicated attendant he had had, how he had circumambulated the Buddha's accommodation out of respect every single night with a lamp in his hand to make sure that the Buddha was having a peaceful night. Ananda was so focused on his dutiful devotion, he could not manage to go beyond stream entry during the Buddha's lifetime, having to coordinate the visits of all various sorts of people to the Buddha, including royalty and business owners, not least the kings of the Malas up to the final moment, trying to not discriminate against anyone. In paragraphs 5.13 through 5.16, we see a description of Ananda's grief, and the Buddha consoles him by way of valediction, speaking of Ananda's 4 exceptional qualities, which are that his appearance and words are pleasing to others, no matter whether they be monks, nuns, laymen, or lay women. Then in paragraphs 5.17 and 5.18, Ananda reprimands himself for letting the Buddha pass away in a country backwater. In response, the Buddha corrects Ananda by speaking of Kusināra's glorious past as Kusavati. In paragraph 5.19 through 5.22, the Buddha has Ananda announce his impending Parinirvana to the Mallas, who are the governors of that region. At the end of the paragraph, in paragraphs 5.23 through 5.30, that Supata, the last convert, is ordained by the Buddha and becomes an arahant. The story of this last convert, Supata, is also quite inspiring, how Supata wanted to listen to the Dharma from the Buddha, and then he actually learned the Dharma in spite of initially being turned away by the Venerable Ananda, who was hesitant to let him disturb the Buddha. However, despite being on his deathbed, the Buddha allowed him to come because he realized that thereafter there would not be any further opportunities to ask any questions. So the Buddha had been very kind towards everyone. He actually asked all the monks and nuns, upasakas and upasikas, to ask any final questions still on their mind, so they wouldn't later regret a missed opportunity. Supata actually did have some questions. He wanted to ask those questions, clear those doubts, and the Buddha explained them to him. So Supata resolved to attain arahantship before the Buddha passed away. So Supata must have made an amazing effort, and his determination was really appreciated by the Buddha later on. He was able to attain arahantship, and at the time when a lot of other mundane monks, nuns, and lay devotees were so grief-stricken, weeping, wailing, and crying, that they could not really meditate. By contrast, Supata was someone who thought that the best form of respect to the Buddha was to practice the Buddha's teaching to the full extent. Lastly, for chapter 5, we see the lion's roar, which is the teaching that converts Supata that in whatsoever Dhamma and discipline there is found the Noble Eightfold Path, there is also found a true ascetic. If Supata the bhikkhus live righteously, the world will not want for arahants. The last part of the sutta is Chapter 6, where the Buddha utters his last few words before his passing away. We find in paragraph 6.1 the Buddha's last instructions with the words, "I have proclaimed and made known as the Dharma and the discipline that shall be your master when I am gone. Let Dhammavinaya be the teacher of Buddhism after the Buddha's Parinibbāna." The Buddha said basically, after my passing away, Ananda, don't worry, the Dhamma and the Vinaya will be there to help you guide disciples. So in effect, he elected the Dhamma and the Vinaya as his successor rather than another living person. We find in paragraph 6.2 that henceforth monks are to respect each other according to seniority, and in paragraph 6.3, the order may have the authority to abrogate the lesser and minor rules. In paragraph 6.4, we see that the Buddha imposes the Brahmadanta penalty on the monk Channa to humble him out of fear that his arrogant behavior when the Buddha was alive would only get worse when he was gone. So the punishment basically involves shunning Channa from involvement in the monastic community until he asks forgiveness and mends his ways. Then comes the most famous part of the sutta, which is the Buddha's last admonition to his disciples. So in paragraph 6.5 through 6.7, we see the Buddha's famous last words. The Buddha's last words in Pali were, "Andatani bhikkhave amantayami wo vayadhamma sankhara apamadena sampathetati," which translates to, "Disciples, this I declare to you, all conditioned things are subject to disintegration. Strive on untiringly for your liberation." So the Buddha is advocating urgency in our spiritual practice, that no matter how many things you have, how much power you have, political, educational, monetary, or whatever, whether you are healthy or long-lived, whether you are rich or poor, none of this really matters, because one day you have to leave this earth, and this is bound to happen without advance warning. So you have to be ready, and that is why he said, be diligent, work hard, and make maximum use of this golden opportunity to attain the Dharma and to escape the cycle of rebirth or samsara. From there we see an account of how the Blessed One passed away into nirvana. From paragraph 6.8 through 6.10, the Buddha's Parinibbāna process is narrated to Venerable Ananda by Venerable Anuruddha. Having said his final words, The Buddha had entered upon the first, second, third, and fourth absorptions one by one. He went through them again in ascending order, and then descending order, and then the Venerable Anuruddha, foremost amongst the divine eye, was the one to track the Buddha through his mental attainments, before taking his final breath. The Buddha was very mindful even up to the last, and peacefully passed away. From there, we find later on in the same paragraph 4 descriptive verses uttered in succession by Brahma Sahampati, Sakka, Anuruddha, and Ananda. At the end of the paragraph 6.10 and into paragraph 6.11, let the monks and devas lament. Finally, the sutta ends with an account of the last rites of the Buddha that take place at Kusinārā. We find in paragraph 6.12 that Ananda announces the Buddha's Parinirvana to the Mallas of Kusinārā. They lament and prepare for the Buddha's last rites. We find in paragraph 6.13 through 6.16 that although the Mallas intended to hold the cremation immediately, but something prevented them from doing so, and the Buddha ended up lying in state for 7 days, so that all the people who wanted to could pay their last respects. Paragraphs 6.17 and 6.18 describe how Ananda instructs the Mallas in their cremation preparations. Paragraph 6.19 describes a journey the Venerable Mahākassapa made between Pāvā and Kusinārā when he learned of the Buddha's Parinirvana. The Venerable Mahākassapa was the senior-most surviving monk at the time. The Venerable Mahākassapa, as you know, was also a forest monk, and since Venerable Sariputta, Venerable Moggallana, and the original 5 disciples had already passed away, it fell to Venerable Mahākassapa to preside over the funeral arrangements. In paragraph 6.20, there was an odd incident when an old stubborn monk called Supata, not the Supata who is the final disciple, makes the infamous statement that, "Enough, friends, do not grieve, do not lament, we are well rid of that great ascetic. Too long, friends, have we been oppressed by his saying, this is fitting for you and this is not fitting for you. Now we will be able to do or not to do what we want as we wish." However, the Mahākassapa pivots the message to not grieving because all compounded things are subject to decay, rather than celebrating freedom from their training taskmaster. In paragraphs 6.21 through 6.23, we see the 4 Malla chiefs try but fail to light the Buddha's funeral pyre. Mahākassapa arrives, and after he and his entourage have paid their last respects, the Buddha's funeral pyre bursts spontaneously into flames. In the final part of the sutta, from paragraph 6.23 through 6.28, there is an account of how the Buddha's relics are equally distributed by Dona Brahmin. So, from what I can tell, there are a handful of issues still outstanding which the sutta draws attention to, which may need a little bit of extra explanation. Namely, Buddha's concern for the perpetuation of the tradition, Buddhist funeral rites, Buddhist holy places and saṁvega, the status of stupas and relics, and the posthumous changing of rules. So, on the topic of the Buddha's concern for perpetuity of the tradition, by the time of the passing of the Buddha, there was already an infrastructure in place whereby enlightened disciples of the 4 communities, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, could train and ordain future generations of enlightened disciples. As for the focus of respect for future generations of disciples, the places associated with the Buddha's life were established as places to inspire future devotion and urgency, with the Dhamma and Vinaya as a future source of clarity on major ethical dilemmas. The Parinirvāna Sutta is also a comprehensive reference on Buddhist funeral rites, which stipulate the wrapping of the body, immersion in fragrant material, and then cremation, with the stipulation that if the faithful offer garlands, scent, or perfume and bow down, it will be for their profit and welfare for a long time to come. However, the erecting of a stupa over the relics left behind in the cremation ashes is to be reserved only for saints and universal monarchs. On the relationship between the Buddhist holy places and inspiring a sense of urgency to practice, there is use of the Pali term saṁvega in the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta, which Kevin Trainer has translated as the shock of conviction that can only be delivered by any perfect and therefore convincing statement of truth. So visit to such places draws attention to the visual and emotional aspect of the experience of saṁvega, linking it with the apprehension of truth, tying together the experience of seeing and knowing. Those who have had the chance to visit the 4 Buddhist holy sites often say that visiting real places associated with the life of the Buddha brings home to them that the Buddha was an actual person and not a legend. Realizing that even the Buddha had the frailties of a human being, it is impossible to pretend that we are any less frail or mortal, so the urgency for us to practice earnestly towards enlightenment is heightened manyfold. Lastly, throughout the Buddha's lifetime, he served as a personal authority for Buddhism in deciding which rules or guidelines of practice to add or adjust. The intention, especially for monastic discipline, was that the major rules would not be further adjusted after the passing of the Buddha. But for the minor or lesser rules, the Buddha bequeathed the Mahāpadesa, or 4 authorities, to allow some flexibility in practice for unpredictable situations Buddhism might encounter in the future. So today we've been looking at the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta. For my next live session online, which will, fingers crossed, be a week on Sunday morning, I'll start to televise my 7-session beginner series. So, for good measure, I'd like to remind viewers to keep the questions coming in about meditation or topics that you've heard in the lecture to the email address that you can see spelled out in the slide, and I'll do my best to answer these on my next session. In the meantime, try to avoid recklessness or complacency, maintain a positive mood, speak only positive words, forgive others, extend good wishes to others, and meditate daily. Hopefully, as a result of today's session, you will be inspired to urgency and non-recklessness in your practice by the precariousness of all conditioned things. So that's all for today. Thanks for viewing. So long, folks, and stay safe.